Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the FTC's big tech battles, Congress's government funding debacle, and the latest economic news. Joining us to discuss all of this are AAF experts Jeff Westling and Gordon Gray. First up is Director of Technology and Innovation, Jeff Westling. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So how have you been? I mean, it's been kind of a busy week with you between policy, and now you have the Arizona Diamondbacks to worry about.
I mean, I'm not really worried. We got a tough series next week against the Dodgers, but looking good so far.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to be a tough one for you all. But, you know, as you have a former Red Sox in the dugout with Torey Lovullo as your manager, I think I'm rooting for them.
Well, you know, everyone can root for the Diamondbacks, especially when we're playing the Dodgers.
Everyone also likes an underdog, so, you know, hopefully we'll have to leave the baseball talk there, but hopefully they pull it out. So let's get into your area. You know, there's been a lot of drama in the tech world recently. The Federal Trade Commission filed 3 antitrust cases, 2 against Google and 1 against Amazon. Just briefly, walk us through what the FTC is alleging in these suits.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. So the FTC is essentially alleging that these companies have monopoly power in a couple different markets, notably search and ad tech for Google and the online marketplace that Amazon runs, and that they are using anti-competitive behavior, anti-competitive means essentially to exclude rivals from those markets. So like Google search being a default on like your Apple iPhone, or Amazon requiring sellers to sell the lowest price on Amazon. But so what the FTC is essentially arguing is that they're going and trying to stifle competition. But I think it's important to remember when you hear that the FTC is trying to, what they say is going after anti-competitive behavior, what they're really going after is behavior that hurts competitors. And that's a very different thing than competition generally, because what we care about when we're looking at competition is the entire ecosystem and mainly the consumer. How is the behavior affecting consumers? So a lot of the stuff that the FTC is targeting, it's unclear whether that's actually harming consumers, that behavior, or whether it's just harming some of the smaller competitors.
Yeah, I know like a lot of what you've written about this year has been on that whole, are we just looking at, is there harm to consumers, or are we changing up the dynamic on how we try these cases? It seems to be the common theme among all of your writings on the antitrust world this year.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's a larger trend right now where we have a Biden administration that approaches competition policy from a lens that concentration is an issue in and of itself. We don't like big firms having a lot of power, whereas a lot of the more traditional, I wouldn't say traditional, but over the last 30, 40 years or so of antitrust analysis is focused on the consumer. Being big isn't a problem when you can integrate a lot of cool features, a lot of different services and technologies into one offering, and the consumer gets a better product at a lower price. And that's what antitrust law has always been trying to protect. And again, the current FTC doesn't really focus on that question. They focus on, can competitors keep up? And should we prop up bad competitors? What we want is competition on the merits.
Yeah.
And that's the focus I've been trying to push out there.
Right. So competition on the merits, obviously this has a huge economic impact. So what could these specific antitrust cases mean from an economic perspective?
Yeah, so from an economic perspective, I think the important thing to remember is that these are cases that can and should be brought if there are anti-competitive behavior, anti-competitive harms. From a broader economic perspective, if these firms do have monopoly power and the FTC is able to show that this behavior actually is harming competition generally, then it's good that they're bringing the case and they should do it. The problem is if that's not the case and they're just going after them like they're just because they're large, like I'm a little bit worried about, then from an economic perspective, the consumer is going to be worse off. They're going to have to pay more for worse quality goods. They're going to have to use things that aren't as beneficial to them, and just generally it harms the consumer. So from a larger perspective, I think that's the lens we should be looking at these cases from. But I do want to reiterate, I'm not someone who's sitting here saying we should never bring antitrust cases. This is an economic question for the courts to examine. I want them to examine some of this behavior, and I think they'll find that the benefits to consumers outweigh any anti-competitive harms. But if I'm wrong, that's why the antitrust law exists.
Yeah, I know from a consumer's perspective that, I'm worried that, how could this change the Google Ads market? I mean, I do a lot of work with Google Ads on my day-to-day basis, so could that be affected? All these, Amazon, I buy almost everything in my life is bought off of Amazon.
Yeah.
How much would, me being able to say, okay, I want to go get the Amazon brand that's $10 less than the actual brand, and with inflation being a big problem right now, that's an important $10 to save. So
it's a great place to go, and the question is essentially, what is the remedy that the FTC is going to seek? And it's not entirely clear in all the cases. I think in the Google cases, they do want structural separation, which means you're going to have to split up Google search from different parts of their business. You're going to have to make it so Google can't prioritize different traffic essentially on their webpage, which means, hey, maybe I go to Google, I search a local restaurant, Maps doesn't show up because they don't want to be self-preferencing their own service.
Wow.
I think for the Amazon case, it's a little less clear where the FTC is going, but if they do something on like the structural separation side, that might mean, hey, fulfillment, packaging, shipping, and storing goods before they sell to consumer, that part of the business needs to be separate from the actual marketplace. And if that happens, that means there's more costs on the seller. That means there's more costs for consumers. So from if they try to split up and break up Amazon, and say you have to have your fulfillment business separate from your marketplace business, that essentially can eliminate the efficiencies of that, and that probably will result in higher prices and potentially worse quality goods.
So that could affect the same day shipping model that they use right now?
It definitely can affect it, because it's not so much that they can eliminate the 2-day shipping, but what it is it's included as part of your Prime bundle, because
right.
They're able to bundle that and give it to the consumer. That's why they're able to offer that on so many products. And essentially what the FTC saying was like, well, if you're not a part of Prime, you're not going to be on the buy box. It's essentially like when you click, I want to buy a product, it gives you the seller. And they always prioritize the Prime seller, which understandable. Prime comes with certainty. It comes with all these different efficiencies. They're saying if you're not a member of Prime, you can't really participate, and therefore we should break that up. And I'm here saying, well, no, I want to be able to get the free 2-day shipping as a part of the service I'm subscribing to. This is all a benefit to me. Yes, I pay for Prime, therefore I should be receiving something in return. And that is the kind of quote unquote trade-off that
wow.
we're dealing with.
Interesting. Let's talk for a minute if DOJ is successful. Could we see Congress get involved in broader antitrust cases? Would they do some legislation here? What could happen if this is successful?
If this is successful, nothing probably happens. That just means that the courts found that either DOJ's or FTC's case against these companies violated the antitrust law, and that means the law is working. I have no issue with that. If the courts come in and say, look, by excluding rivals on the default search, you're harming competition, there's no benefits to consumer for that, I don't know if they'll find that, but if they did, that's fine with me. My worry is that if they come out and say, actually, no, these aren't harmful to consumers, yeah, it's going to be harder for Bing, or it's going to be harder for Yelp, or whoever else out there is trying to compete with Google and Amazon. It might be harder for the individual competitors, but the consumers are competition as a whole is benefiting. I'm worried that Congress may step in and have that same pervasive thought of big is bad and say we need to pass legislation like American Innovation and Choice Online Act, which essentially bans self-preferencing. And again, self-preferencing comes from integration. It's like we're preferencing our own products because we're putting them all into one bundle and we're giving those to the consumers. So my concern is that if the businesses win the case and the FTC and DOJ lose their respective cases, we're going to find that Congress will pass legislation that's trying to correct what the court has already found to not harm consumers.
Interesting, yeah. It'll be interesting to watch all that play out between the cases and what we could also see from Congress going forward on antitrust, big tech type legislation. So I'm sure you'll be keeping a watchful eye on that, plus all of your other sports teams as we go forward here in the World Series. But thanks for coming on and breaking this down for us.
Thanks for having me.
Now let's welcome Vice President for Economic Policy, Gordon Gray, to the podcast. Thank you for joining us, Gordon.
Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you back on here. There's been a fair amount going on in your world.
Just one or two things. Well,
I figured
all of our world.
It's probably a good idea to have you on and talk about some of these things. And of course, that is the funding the government debate.
Yeah.
On September 30th, Congress And the president squeaked through a continuing resolution to fund the government through November 15th. Does that sound right?
I believe it's 17th.
17th, somewhere in that area. Just start by breaking down what happened over the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, if it weren't so consequential, it would be easy to dismiss the weekend's shenanigans as basically students who wait till the absolute last minute to do all of their homework. And in a way, that's what some of the rhetoric has been about, which is the House and the Senate have been deliberating on appropriations bills, essentially the funding for the executive agencies. And we get to the end of the fiscal year, and functionally none of them have really been passed or socialized between the chambers. Setting the table a bit, we may recall that, and we talked about this in previous podcasts, but we put the pin back in the debt limit grenade through the enactment of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which reinstituted caps on discretionary spending. And those caps kick in FY 2024. And that was supposed to provide some stability, predictability to discretionary funding. As it happens, Congress managed to talk themselves out of stability, predictability, and in terms of the funding of the agencies, because the two chambers came to that deal and then promptly sort of got back to their own business. And what that ended up with was that the two chambers had very different approaches to funding the government. The House was enacting appropriations acts that were about $100 billion less than the ones that the Senate was working on, which were broadly hewed to the statutory caps. So that was the background, which is they came to a tentative, uneasy deal. And we're gravitating towards a last-minute outcome one way or another.
Yeah, I like that analogy, I guess, of waiting till the last minute to do your school, in college. We've all been there. I think I did that. I had a few all-nighters I had to pull because, oh crap, that paper's due tomorrow.
I like to think that my capacity to procrastinate in college was just good training for working in politics and policy.
Exactly. But I think it's also important to note that this debate over funding the government, and there's a lot of talk about the debt, which is an important conversation to have.
There's a lot of talk about it,
but we're not really. But when you're talking about this, and you write a lot about this with your budget chart books, with all of your other things, we're only talking about a small portion of the actual budget itself.
It's the $100 billion is a lot of money.
Yeah.
It is incidental as a percentage of our annual deficits, which doubled over the last year from about $1 to $2 trillion. And look, we're out of the emergencies of the recent past, where I think bipartisan majorities, two different administrations, were enacting measures to respond to a generational and several generational challenges. That's done. And so stuff like, President Biden just defying the Supreme Court and pouring more money into student loan forgiveness and things like that is just a radical departure from this notion that we are on anything other than a violently unsustainable fiscal trajectory.
So speaking of the trajectory, let's just stick with the funding the government debate and discuss where we go from here. Congress has a little over a month to come to an agreement, and now the House must elect a new speaker through all of this.
Yeah, I read
lots
about
of fun. There was something about that on the news yesterday. But we have lots of fun going on in this whole world. How do you see this shaking out?
In this instance, I think, with respect to the speaker's race that is unfolding, I have no value added in this. I can engage in some rank political speculation,
right.
On your podcast time, but I'll spare the listeners. Rather, I would just separate that there is a political system, and then that is related to and highly correlated with sort of the business of the legislature, but they are nevertheless different processes, and the political system will eventually produce an outcome. What the dimensions of that is best left to folks with better insight than I. But it will produce an outcome, and then we will have yet again 2 chambers of Congress, and they will face yet another deadline. Mm-hmm. Almost certainly, they will find themselves in that position of. That you and I did as college students, and that Congress finds itself in all the time.
So I mean, but do you see? Obviously, there's going to be another threat of a shutdown here. Where probably you have all those great papers that we'll probably be pushing out again in a few weeks.
Absolutely,
that we did last week.
It's really sad that all my shutdown papers become salient every couple of years.
Yeah.
It would be a good thing if no one had to read those.
Right, but I mean, what are the chances that we get a good deal? Or maybe even get the appropriations bills over the finish line, which in an ideal world is probably where we should be at anyways.
I think the 2 choices that will likely confront Congress in November are, and I've seen very good arguments, 2 polar opposite outcomes, and I've seen very good arguments for why each is more likely. So. And again, this is much of that is a function of the political system producing an outcome. And the two most likely outcomes, again, are diametrically opposed, which is a CR or a shutdown. I think that there's reason to imagine that just continued disharmony, disunity in the House. No one... over the weekend, it was unclear the shutdown was characterized, I think, aptly as the Seinfeld shutdown, because no one really understood what the tensions were. Mm-hmm. They were poorly articulated, and that is almost certainly going to be the case in November. We'll have the same set of issues. The outcome then was a CR that kept the government open. To be fair, that defunded, at least temporarily, or failed to continue to provide additional funding for Ukraine. That issue is not going away. Mm-hmm. And eventually we need to have that debate. And that will animate the speaker's race. We know that already. So I think continued disharmony could suggest that the House simply can't produce an outcome. They can't arrive at something as straightforward as keeping the government open. Or a very good argument is that all of that, to the extent that was the case most recently, the outcome was another CR to avoid a shutdown. Mm-hmm. So if that's sort of the default scenario currently, there's every reason to imagine why that would remain the default scenario. But both of those outcomes, I think, you and I both and others can very much see obvious paths to either. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, I think it is unknowable.
Yeah.
A lot of the decisions have not been made.
Yeah. I mean, I've been around now long enough to see, I've seen both episodes play out. So, I can see paths leading us in both directions. It's just which way would you rather go here? I
mean, we've seen just in the vote to remove the speaker recently. Some people, I think, made up their minds at the last minute, and people who where'd that come from? Yeah. And so that will animate future votes, and
exactly.
I simply have no way of predicting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, but on the bright side, it's going to be lots of content for you coming up. So get ready for that. I'm going to have you take your fiscal expert hat off for a second and put your economic
happily
hat on.
The fiscal hat is.
I mean, you're on the podcast, and tomorrow is Jobs Day.
Indeed.
So as the author of Gordon's Guesstimate. I can't let you leave without giving us an early jobs number prediction and your thoughts, and then also your thoughts on how this could impact the Fed's near-term action. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think we're in this situation where, as a fellow foodie, Kyle, you'll appreciate this metaphor. Probably Doug less so. I kind of view the labor market.
He might not let us on the podcast to get together again if we start talking
Good
food.
point. Nevertheless, I kind of think of the labor market right now as like a really heavy cast iron skillet that has been heated pretty well to a fairly well and is slowly cooling off, but it's dense and has tremendous density, and so it'll take a while for the heat to cool off. And so we continue to see, in the face of I think pretty clear cooling off of the labor market, nevertheless sort of resilience, sort of enduring strength. Things like the job openings report that we saw earlier this week. I don't think we should see that as a return to the energy in the labor market that we've seen even in the recent past. But nevertheless, I think that's suggestive that we're not about ready to fall off a cliff. But now we're sort of it's a little more delicate, right? Like last labor market report, we saw a big jump in unemployment. That's a little concerning. My expectation is that will come down again, and I expect the indicators that we've seen aren't suggestive of a sort of a major movement away from last month. And in the absence of any other information, that's the best I can do. I have seen indicators on the margin of more cooling, so the ISM reports continue to show some cooling. ADP shows continued weak demand for labor among large firms. Nevertheless, small and medium-sized firms continue to be dynamic. All of that, initial claims more or less flat. All of that is, to me, in the absence of any other news, is just a report similar to last month's. And so that's where I'm going. Somewhere in the 150s, probably.
150s? Interesting. All right. Well, we'll have to pay attention tomorrow and see how that looks. So the Fed here, I mean, they obviously have to look at all this and then make sense of it, how to get the pan cooled to the right temperature so that, it's not like it's going to go too cold and you got to reseason it and all that stuff to keep the metaphor going a little bit. So, I mean, they've indicated that they're probably going to keep interest rates high for a while. Yeah. We could see another jump later this their next meeting. It's all wait and see kind of thing on how the numbers shake out. So, what are they looking at? What do you see them doing?
And Doug does a good job sort of characterizing the inflation situation, and it remains stubborn. Progress has been made by the Fed, significant, progress, because of significant run-ups in interest rates. And particularly on the longer end of the yield curve, we've seen some movement on interest rates recently that are, concerning. And as I said before, I think that the broad sweep of the labor market indicators, the economy generally, is suggestive of slowing down, which is essentially the policy of the Federal Reserve. And so right now I see little reason to move the Fed off of the sort of current trajectory of monetary policy.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to see how this all shakes out as well. But I just want to quickly say that if you are listening to this podcast today before tomorrow, then you should go to AmericanActionForum.org/subscribe to the Daily Dish and the U6 for his post-game analysis, if you will.
Absolutely.
Get both of those. And if you are listening to it after tomorrow, you should still sign up for those because there's 2 more this year and plenty more to come next year. Great pieces of read. Of course, you'll also get Doug's thoughts Mondays for the rest of the time, but great reads nonetheless. So, Gordon, thanks for coming on and talking through all these issues with us. And as I said, we'll probably have you back in a few weeks as Congress finds themselves right back in the same situation.
All right, thanks for having
again,
me
Gordon. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.